Some mornings carry no warning. They drift in like a soft breeze, unremarkable, unburdened, and nearly invisible in their calm. That was the kind of morning it seemed to be at Charleston International Airport. The sun had just begun to climb, casting a warm amber glow over polished floors and tall glass panels. Passengers moved through the terminal in quiet waves, rolling suitcases humming like background music. There were no delays, no loud announcements, just order. Jordan Campbell adjusted the strap of his leather duffel bag as he walked beside his younger sister Naomi. At 17, Jordan carried himself with the measured calm of someone twice his age, broad-shouldered, with a thoughtful gaze and a voice that rarely rose above conversation. Naomi, 15, walked half a step behind him, clutching a gold-wrapped gift box to her chest. Inside it, nestled in layers of tissue paper, was a music box they'd spent hours selecting. It played Claire de Lune, their grandmother's favorite piece. The siblings didn't speak as they passed through security. They didn't need to. There was a rhythm between them that only came from years of walking through the world with unspoken awareness. A rhythm shaped by shared glances when teachers said too much, by silent patience in dressing rooms and check-in counters, and by the subtle, coded language Black families teach their children without words. Be calm, be kind, be alert. They were flying to Denver for their grandmother's 80th birthday. First class, seats 2A and 2B, courtesy of their uncle, Avery Campbell, who happened to be the founder and executive chairman of Sky High Air, the very airline operating the flight. But Jordan and Naomi didn't advertise that. They didn't mention who Avery was, or what he did, or what his last name meant in the aviation world. They just walked quietly to gate 12. The woman at the counter, young and cheerful, scanned their boarding passes and smiled. "Enjoy your flight," she said. Jordan nodded politely. Naomi offered a soft thank you, her fingers tightening on the gift box as they stepped onto the jet bridge. Inside the plane, the first-class cabin shimmered under a soft glow. Leather seats gleamed, overhead compartments clicked open and shut, and the air smelled faintly of citrus and expensive fabric. Jordan helped Naomi lift her small carry-on into the bin, then took the window seat. Naomi settled beside him, careful to nestle the gift box under the seat ahead. For a moment, everything felt right. Jordan leaned back, watching as ground crews bustled below. Naomi unwrapped a piece of mint gum and offered one to her brother. They didn't talk about school or music or even their grandmother's party. They just sat in silence, letting the moment wash over them. And then, like a sudden change in wind direction, it shifted. The woman who approached them had a posture so sharp it could have been carved. Her navy uniform was pressed to perfection, her blonde hair slicked back in a tight bun, and her expression said everything her words had not yet delivered. "Excuse me," she said, voice loud enough to cut through idle chatter. "Are you certain you're in the correct seats?" Jordan looked up slowly, blinking once before answering. "Yes, ma'am. These are our seats." He extended the folded boarding passes. The woman, Teresa Langford, senior flight supervisor, glanced at them but didn't take them right away. Her eyes flicked from the tickets to Jordan's hoodie, then to Naomi's braids, then to the gold box tucked neatly beneath her feet. "First class," and she said flatly. "These seats are for priority passengers." Naomi sat up straighter, her fingers curling around the edge of her seat. Jordan kept his tone even. "We are priority passengers. These seats are assigned, 2A and 2B. This time Teresa took the passes. She examined them with exaggerated care, her brow furrowed as though deciphering a foreign language. A long pause followed, long enough for nearby passengers to glance over curiously, long enough for Naomi to feel her cheeks flush with heat. Finally, Teresa handed the tickets back with a short nod. "Fine," she said. She didn't apologize, didn't smile, just turned on her heel and strode down the aisle with clipped footsteps. Naomi leaned toward her brother. "Was that normal?" she whispered. Jordan didn't respond, not because he didn't know the answer, but because he knew it too well. The moment Teresa Langford walked away, the cabin seemed to exhale, just slightly. Naomi reached for her water bottle with hands that weren't quite steady, trying to pretend her skin didn't still burn under the weight of that woman's stare. Jordan remained still, not tense, not slouched, just still. His expression gave nothing away. But Naomi had known him long enough to see the storm behind his eyes. They had seen this before. In department stores where clerks followed them too closely. At school meetings where teachers spoke around them instead of to them. In restaurants where waiters hesitated at their table, waiting for a sign that they belonged. Still, the plane began its final boarding. Passengers trickled in, some in suits, others in sweatpants. A mother wrangled a toddler into a seat across the aisle, and a man behind them ordered tomato juice before even sitting down. Everything moved with the quiet, controlled energy of pre-takeoff routine. But Naomi couldn't settle. She glanced at Jordan. "Are we okay?" she asked quietly. "We're okay," he said, calm as ever. "We're in our seats." She nodded, but something inside her still coiled tight. And then, it happened. The moment that cracked the routine like glass under pressure. Teresa returned. This time she didn't fake politeness. She stood directly in front of them, her arms crossed, mouth set like concrete. "I need you both to move to the back," she said. No explanation. No offer to check their tickets again. No acknowledgement that this was the second time she'd approached the same two passengers with the same unfounded suspicion. Jordan blinked. Once. Twice. "I'm sorry," he said. His tone was controlled but pointed. Teresa's lips thinned. "Those seats are needed for other passengers." "What passengers?" Jordan asked. She didn't answer. She just repeated, "I need you to move." Naomi felt her stomach drop. Her fingers clutched the gold ribbon of the gift box like a lifeline. "We're not moving," Jordan said, his voice low but firm. "Not unless the captain says so." A beat of silence followed, short but sharp. Passengers nearby had started to listen now. One man lowered his newspaper. A woman with silver earrings glanced over, frowning. Teresa's face flushed. "Then I'll call security," she snapped. Naomi felt tears sting her eyes but blinked them back. She didn't cry. Not here. Not in first class. She reached into her purse, pulled out her phone, and began typing quickly. A simple message. "Uncle Avery, she's trying to force us out of our seats. Again." Jordan saw her send it, said nothing. Just sat taller. Teresa spun on her heel, heading toward the front of the cabin, her heels striking the floor like a gavel. Conversations paused, eyes turned. Phones slipped out of bags in that subtle, quiet way people record what they think might go viral. Naomi's hands trembled. She whispered, "What if they make us leave?" Jordan didn't look at her when he answered. "Then they'll have to answer for it." Near the cockpit, Teresa picked up the handset with shaking fingers. "Captain, I have 2 non-compliant passengers in first class," she said into the receiver, her voice sharp with rehearsed authority. "They're refusing to move when asked. I need ground security immediately." There was a pause, long. Static buzzed faintly. Then a voice came through. Calm, cool, controlled. "This is Avery Campbell." Silence rippled through the cabin like a power outage. Jordan looked up, his face unreadable. Naomi's lips parted, but no words came. Back near the front, Teresa stood frozen, the handset still at her ear, the color draining from her face. The voice continued, soft but unyielding. "Would you like to explain why my niece and nephew are being publicly challenged for seats they purchased, despite having valid first-class boarding passes?" The pause that followed was longer than the one before. Passengers glanced at each other. One man took out his earbuds. A woman held her phone higher, pretending to scroll as she recorded silently. Teresa's voice cracked. I wasn't aware," Avery cut in. "That," he said, "is exactly the problem." Teresa stood there, humiliated, the phone still in her hand, unsure whether to speak or run. In the second row, Naomi let out a shaky breath. Jordan, still stone still, said nothing. But the weight of what had just happened was not lost on him. They hadn't raised their voices, hadn't caused a scene. They had simply refused to move. And the truth had arrived, not with sirens or shouting, but with a calm voice that leveled the playing field in an instant. Teresa Langford stood near the galley, still gripping the cabin phone like it might save her from drowning. But the line was dead now. Avery Campbell's voice no longer echoed in her ear, yet the sting of his words lingered, sharp, precise, and mercilessly composed. The passengers around her hadn't said anything. They didn't need to. Their silence had become a kind of verdict. Her cheeks flushed a deep, burning red as she lowered the handset. From her vantage point, she could still see Jordan and Naomi in row 2, quiet, composed, still seated. Naomi's shoulders trembled slightly, but her hands remained steady on the gift box in her lap. Jordan sat with his legs uncrossed, one hand resting calmly on the armrest, the other holding his phone, unread. They hadn't moved. They hadn't faltered. They hadn't needed to. Teresa inhaled sharply, forcing herself to walk back down the aisle. She didn't know what she would say. She only knew she had to say something. To them, to the captain, to the others who were watching. And they were watching. Every step toward them felt like a courtroom march. Naomi caught sight of her first. Jordan didn't move. Teresa stopped beside their row. She opened her mouth, then closed it again. She began, then faltered. Your uncle didn't identify himself earlier. I wasn't informed of... Jordan raised his eyes slowly to meet hers. You didn't ask, he said, voice even. And we didn't need to explain who we were. Teresa swallowed. I thought... She couldn't finish the sentence, because what she'd thought didn't sound good outside her head. That 2 black teenagers in first class without fanfare must have been out of place. That maybe they'd made a mistake, or that the system had. I see, she whispered instead. You didn't, Naomi said quietly but firmly. You didn't see us at all. The words landed heavier than anything their uncle had said. Teresa stepped back. She turned to walk away, but was met by the pale, uncertain face of Clara Nguyen, the junior flight attendant assigned to the first-class cabin that morning. Clara had watched everything, heard every word, and now she stood with a folded paper in her hand, an internal message from HQ, just forwarded to the crew. Clara's voice was barely audible. Teresa, you've been requested to step aside from duty pending review. They want you to remain on board but off shift. Captain Whitaker has been instructed to assign alternate oversight. It was happening. The unraveling. Passengers murmured now, soft, barely restrained. Teresa looked around and saw faces she recognized not as people, but as witnesses. Every move she'd made had been public. Teresa stepped toward the rear of the cabin, moving like someone underwater, every limb heavy with dread. Clara followed, eyes low, voice hesitant. Do you want to sit down? She asked gently. But Teresa didn't answer. She simply leaned against the wall near the galley, her badge cool against her chest, her breath catching. In the cabin, Jordan and Naomi said nothing. They didn't have to. A few rows behind, a businessman in a gray blazer leaned over the aisle toward the siblings. I just want to say, he said softly, I saw the way you both handled that. With grace, with restraint. You didn't deserve that treatment. Jordan nodded politely. Naomi offered a small smile, her lips trembling with the pressure of everything she had held in. Across the aisle, an elderly woman in a tweed coat gave Naomi a slight nod. Her expression was kind, not pitying, and her eyes shimmered as though she had seen something she recognized. Something familiar from a time long past. You remind me of my granddaughter, she said, barely louder than a whisper. Naomi's eyes filled again. She turned to Jordan and leaned her head on his shoulder. I just wanted to fly, she whispered, voice fraying at the edges. I was excited. Jordan placed his hand gently over hers. I know, he said softly. You didn't do anything wrong. And yet, for a moment, it had felt like they had. That's what stung the most. The quiet shame that tried to creep in, the pressure to justify their presence. The years of knowing they would always have to prove themselves worthy of spaces they had every right to occupy. But not today. Today, they would not be moved. At the front of the cabin, Captain Dean Whitaker sat in the cockpit, headset slightly askew, his jaw locked in tension. He hadn't known the names, but the moment Avery Campbell's voice rang through the handset, everything had changed. This was no longer just a passenger conflict. This was a reckoning. The door behind him opened, and Clara stepped in briefly. Sir, she said gently, ground control has confirmed that Mr. Campbell's directive stands. Ms. Langford is to be removed from operational duty immediately upon landing. He nodded once. Acknowledged. And sir, Clara hesitated. Passengers are recording. He let out a long, tired breath. Of course they are. Back in first class, Jordan watched the cabin quiet again. The storm was receding, or at least its winds had shifted direction. He looked at Naomi, still holding the gold box. He brushed a loose strand of hair from her face and leaned in slightly. "We're okay," he murmured. Naomi nodded slowly, but the cabin would never forget what had happened, and neither would she. There is a kind of silence that's heavier than sound. It doesn't come from absence, it comes from pressure. The kind that settles on your chest like fog, thick and clinging, as if the air itself is listening. That's the silence that now hung in the first-class cabin of Flight 607. Every passenger had returned to their seat. Conversations were hushed, hands moved more deliberately, and glances, so many glances, flickered toward row 2, where Jordan and Naomi Campbell sat like anchors of stillness amid the churning unease. They hadn't moved, they hadn't cried, but the entire cabin had changed because of them, and they felt it. Naomi rested her chin on her hand, her eyes downcast. The gift box sat between her feet, its gold ribbon slightly askew. Jordan stared straight ahead, one foot gently tapping against the floor in a rhythm only he could hear. Neither spoke. Behind them, Teresa Langford remained pressed against the galley wall near the rear of the plane. Her arms were crossed, her knuckles white. Her badge was still pinned to her blouse, though it no longer meant anything. She wasn't the crew now. She was the reason the crew had fallen under review. Clara Nguyen, the junior attendant, stepped quietly down the aisle with a tray of water and cookies. She stopped at row 2, her tone softer than it had been all morning. "Can I get you anything?" she asked, voice low, tentative. Naomi blinked up at her, momentarily caught off guard. She shook her head. "No, thank you." Jordan offered a polite nod. "We're okay." Clara set down the tray on the empty seat across the aisle anyway. "In case you change your mind," she said gently. Then she added, "I just wanted to say, I saw what happened, and I'm sorry." Naomi gave her a quiet smile. It was the first genuine kindness since the ordeal began. Clara hesitated before stepping away. She didn't look back. Further down the plane, passengers whispered behind open magazines, beneath headphones, and across tray tables. Their words were soft, but their meaning traveled. "Did you hear what the captain said? They're the CEO's family. I can't believe she thought they didn't belong." Some spoke with guilt, others with curiosity, a few with the unmistakable sting of self-reflection. A woman in her 50s leaned across the aisle to her husband. "You know," she said, "I saw her, Teresa, when they boarded. I noticed the way she looked at them. I just didn't think she'd go that far." The man shook his head. "She didn't think she'd get caught." In the cockpit, Captain Dean Whitaker sat rigid, his gaze flickering between instruments and his reflection in the side window. He had flown through tropical storms and emergency landings, but never through something like this. "Cabin ready," the first officer said, his voice hollow. "Copy," Whitaker replied. His hand hovered over the intercom switch, then withdrew. What was there left to say? Meanwhile, in row 2, Jordan glanced down at his phone. A message from Uncle Avery had come through. "Landing crew has been notified. A statement will be issued. Proud of you both. Stay calm." He showed Naomi. She stared at the screen for a long moment before nodding. "I don't want her to lose everything," she said suddenly. Jordan looked at her. "Naomi, I know she was wrong," she added, her voice small but steady. "I know it was cruel, but I don't know. Part of me just wishes she'd seen us. Not after the phone call. Before." Jordan let the words settle. He didn't say it, but he understood her. He understood the ache of being invisible until someone powerful says your name. The shame of needing someone else's authority to validate your worth. The cold reality that dignity, when you're young and black, often depends not on what you do, but who's watching when it happens. "She didn't see us," he said finally. "And maybe now she will." In the rear jump seat, Teresa sat with her arms wrapped around her waist like she was trying to hold herself together. Her thoughts spun in tight, panicked loops. 13 years of service, commendations, overnight shifts, medical emergencies, de-escalation drills. And now she would be remembered not for her career, but for one decision. The wrong one. She could feel eyes on her back. Real or imagined, it didn't matter. Every glance felt like judgment. Every breath she took felt borrowed. Her badge felt like a lie. 30 minutes later, the intercom crackled. "Ladies and gentlemen," Captain Whitaker's voice came on, clipped but even. "We've received new directives from ground control. Upon arrival, passengers are asked to remain seated until the crew completes a priority deplaning process. Thank you for your cooperation." No one asked questions. They knew. Jordan looked at Naomi. "That means they're here already?" She nodded. "Uncle Avery." Jordan tilted his head slightly, eyes scanning forward. "And probably more." Outside, the lights of Denver International gleamed on the horizon, scattered like stars across the tarmac. The plane descended slowly, and the cabin lights dimmed. For the first time since boarding, Naomi closed her eyes. Not from exhaustion, but from resolve. Jordan rested his hand gently on the box between them. They hadn't moved, and the world had shifted around them. The landing gear touched the tarmac with a soft thud, followed by the familiar hum of reverse thrusters. But this wasn't a routine arrival, not for the passengers, and certainly not for the crew. Every vibration felt amplified. Every sound, mechanical or human, seemed to hang longer in the air than it should. Inside the cabin of Flight 607, no one stood. They had heard the captain's announcement. They had felt the weight behind his voice, and they understood, perhaps more deeply than he'd intended, that something larger than luggage and connections was unfolding here. Jordan and Naomi Campbell sat quietly, seatbelts still fastened. Naomi's hand rested atop the gold-wrapped gift box. Her fingers traced the ribbon absent-mindedly. Jordan sat straight, arms crossed loosely, his gaze fixed forward. The calm on his face was deliberate, practiced. It wasn't the calm of peace. It was the calm of someone who refused to be shaken in public. From the rear of the aircraft, Teresa Langford hadn't moved. Her shoulders were stiff, her jaw clenched so tightly that her temples ached. The once crisp collar of her uniform now felt like a noose. Her badge, though still technically attached, may as well have been turned to ash. Clara Nguyen stood silently at the front galley, her hands gently clasped at her waist. She glanced back toward the cabin. Her eyes met Jordan's for just a moment. She gave a small nod, half apology, half solidarity. Then the jet bridge aligned. The forward cabin door hissed open. Bright fluorescent terminal light flooded into the space like a searchlight. Framed in the doorway was a figure in a tailored charcoal gray suit, standing tall, immovable. His presence didn't need an introduction. Avery Campbell had arrived. At his side stood two individuals in business attire, one with a clipboard, the other holding a security badge. Just behind them, a silent wall of airport security officers. The formation wasn't aggressive. It was deliberate, formal. This wasn't a confrontation. It was a reckoning. A murmur rippled through first class. Passengers craned their necks subtly. Some didn't even try to be discreet. Phones remained tucked away, but the tension in the air was so electric it could have powered every screen on board. Avery stepped forward, his expression unreadable. Not angry, not performative, just steady. Jordan stood slowly, straightening his jacket. Naomi rose beside him, clutching the gift box with both hands now. Together they faced their uncle. "You all right?" Avery asked quietly. Jordan gave a small nod. Naomi answered, "Yes, sir." "Good." He looked them over with eyes that saw not just their faces, but everything they had endured in the last hour. "You did well. You stayed calm." Naomi blinked away the pressure behind her eyes. "We just didn't want to cause trouble." "You didn't," Avery replied. "Trouble caused itself." He stepped back, turning toward the crew still standing nearby. "I'd like a word with the captain and the senior flight attendant, now." Clara hesitated. "Captain Whitaker is in the cockpit. I'll call him forward." Avery turned toward the passengers. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, projecting just enough to carry his voice without raising it, "thank you for your patience. Due to a reported incident of misconduct during boarding and flight operations, we are pausing deplaning briefly to ensure appropriate accountability is taken and to preserve the dignity of all passengers affected." It wasn't a corporate statement. It wasn't PR fluff. It was the truth, delivered plainly. A wave of unspoken approval swept through the cabin. Moments later, Captain Whitaker emerged. His posture was rigid, like a man unsure whether he was stepping into a briefing or a verdict. Teresa followed at a distance, her steps slow, her face pale. She looked 10 years older than she had that morning. "Mr. Campbell," Whitaker said with a respectful nod. Avery didn't waste time. "Captain, your report has been filed. Teresa Langford has been named directly in a discrimination-related incident involving passengers under my care. My niece and nephew." Whitaker's jaw tightened. "I understand." Avery turned to Teresa, who stood barely breathing. "Ms. Langford, effective immediately, you are to be removed from active flight status. You will surrender your badge, your access credentials, and you will be escorted by ground personnel to the administration office." The words hit like bricks, softly delivered, but inescapable. "I—" Teresa's voice cracked. "I didn't know who they were." "That," Avery said, "is precisely the issue." Naomi flinched, just slightly. Jordan placed a hand gently on her shoulder. Teresa stared at the floor. Then after a long silence, she slowly reached up and unclipped her badge. Her hand shook as she placed it into Clara's outstretched palm. No one applauded. No one sneered. But everyone felt the moment shift again, like tectonic plates beneath the aisle. Jordan and Naomi were escorted off the plane first, not as VIPs, not as victims, but simply as two teenagers who had refused to be diminished. Cameras waited beyond the gate, but Avery shielded them with his frame, his presence an unspoken barrier between them and the noise. At the terminal exit, Avery turned to them. "This won't be buried," he said. "We're issuing a full public statement. No euphemisms, no shielding. People will know what happened. And why?" Naomi nodded, her throat tight. Jordan looked up at his uncle. "Will they know our names?" Avery paused. "Only if you want them to." Jordan looked at Naomi. She gave the faintest nod. "Let them know," Jordan said. "They should see what dignity looks like." By the time the sun began to rise over the Denver skyline, the story had already escaped the airport. It was no longer about a delay, no longer just a misunderstanding. It was a headline. A blurry photo had been posted to a flight forum, then copied, reposted, and shared again. The image showed two black teenagers seated quietly in first class, with a caption that read, "Flight attendant tries to eject the CEO's niece and nephew. Captain steps in. Plane delayed." Within an hour, the post had more than 50,000 shares. By noon, it was trending on 3 platforms. By evening, it had a name: the Campbell flight. Inside a quiet conference room at Sky High Air's headquarters, Avery Campbell sat at the head of a long glass table. Around him, a small team of senior executives reviewed live updates, legal notes, and drafted responses. A screen on the wall displayed a muted news broadcast. A scrolling headline beneath the anchor read, "CEO's family reportedly targeted in first-class incident. Airline faces backlash." The anchor's mouth moved silently as a clip rolled. A grainy phone video capturing Teresa Langford's raised voice and Jordan's calm reply. "We're not moving unless the captain tells us." Avery studied the image. "Have we finalized the language?" he asked, voice even. The communications director nodded. "Yes, sir. No vague phrases. We've removed terms like misunderstanding or unintentional misstep. It's blunt. It names the behavior, and it names the consequence." Avery leaned forward slightly, fingers interlaced. "Good. The public doesn't need comfort. They need clarity." Another executive looked up. "What about legal exposure?" "We're not worried about lawsuits," Avery said. "We're worried about culture." Silence followed, a respectful one. Back in the guest suite where Jordan and Naomi were staying, the atmosphere was more still, but no less charged. Naomi sat cross-legged on the wide windowsill, watching cars inch along wet pavement below. She held the gold gift box in her lap like a secret she didn't know how to share anymore. Her phone buzzed nonstop, but she didn't check it. Jordan sat nearby, laptop open, reading comments. Some supportive, some angry, many confused. Why does race have to be part of this? They were calm. I would have lost it. This is why bias training isn't optional. He rubbed his temples and looked toward Naomi. "You okay?" She nodded slowly, but her voice didn't match. I didn't want to become a hashtag. Jordan closed the laptop. I know. He crossed the room and sat beside her on the sill. For a while, neither of them said anything. Outside, the city buzzed with its usual rhythm. Inside, the quiet between them felt sacred. Finally, Naomi broke the silence. I keep thinking about her face, she said. When Uncle Avery said his name, the way she just collapsed. Jordan looked down. She thought she had power. She didn't think we did. Naomi rested her head on his shoulder. Do you think she regrets it? Jordan didn't answer right away. Then, maybe, but regret doesn't undo what you chose when you thought no one would stop you. Meanwhile, in a downtown cafe, Teresa Langford sat alone at a small corner table. Her uniform was gone, her badge surrendered. The coffee in front of her had gone cold hours ago. Across the room, a young man glanced at her, narrowed his eyes, and then whispered something to the barista. She didn't have to wonder what they were saying. She already knew. Her name hadn't been released publicly yet, but it would be. And when it was, her face, captured mid-sentence in dozens of phone videos, would become the shorthand for the moment she tried to quietly remove two children from a space they had every right to occupy. She had rehearsed so many justifications since that moment. They looked confused. Maybe they were lost. I was following instinct, but every one of those thoughts rang hollow now, because none of them explained why her tone had changed. Why had her hands gone to her hips? Why hadn't she simply scanned the boarding passes like she would for anyone else? The answer had always been there, but she hadn't wanted to look. Back in the suite, Naomi finally checked her phone. Dozens of texts from friends. A message from her grandmother. Proud of you, sweetheart. You carried yourself with grace. Another from her father, short but powerful. You didn't raise your voice, but you were heard. She smiled, and for the first time since stepping off the plane, it reached her eyes. Jordan looked over. Good news? She nodded. The best. By nightfall, Sky High Air released its statement. No corporate evasiveness, no ongoing investigation. It read, we confirm that two of our first-class passengers, Jordan and Naomi Campbell, were wrongly challenged by a crew member during boarding. Their tickets were valid. Their behavior was respectful. The employee involved has been removed from active duty. This was not a policy issue. It was a judgment issue. We do not tolerate bias, silent or spoken. To Jordan and Naomi, we apologize. To all passengers who've ever felt unseen, we promise, we are listening now. It was reposted tens of thousands of times. Clips of the siblings sitting calmly as Teresa raised her voice became digital symbols of quiet power. Influencers stitched together reactions, activists used it to reframe systemic conversations, and even competing airlines issued subtle nods of support. And through it all, Jordan and Naomi stayed mostly offline. Because they didn't need to explain what dignity looked like. They had already shown it. The following afternoon, while social media continued to flood with hashtags, opinion pieces, and video compilations, something quietly shifted. It wasn't another viral post, not a celebrity retweet. It was an email sent to Sky High Air's Ethics and Compliance Division. Subject line, I know that flight attendant, and I think it's time I told you what happened to me. The sender, Dr. Camille Rivers. At 38 years old, Camille was not someone who sought the spotlight. A professor of cultural history at a Midwestern university, she'd spent most of her adult life in quiet resistance, writing, mentoring, and helping others navigate the tangled roots of systemic bias. But years before she earned her doctorate or lectured about post-colonial identity, Camille had sat in row 17 of a Sky High Air flight. 3 rows from the back, economy cabin, seat 17B. She had been 24 at the time, just out of grad school, flying to interview for her first teaching position. She had dressed with care, worn a blazer over a cream blouse, small pearl studs, a satchel with printed resumes. She had arrived early, smiled at the gate agent, and boarded with Group 3. When she'd asked a flight attendant, tall, blonde, assertive, if she might store her satchel in an overhead bin closer to the front for safety, the woman had looked her up and down and replied, loud enough for others to hear, "You're in row 17, stay there. We saved these bins for passengers who paid more." Camille remembered every word. She remembered the burning in her face. The man beside her shifted uncomfortably but said nothing. She remembered swallowing the humiliation like medicine, necessary, bitter, and expected. The attendant's name? Teresa Langford. Camille had never filed a complaint. She had told herself it wasn't worth it. That was just a comment. That she hadn't been kicked off the flight or screamed at. That it wasn't bad enough. But now watching Naomi and Jordan Campbell endure the same tone, the same dismissal, the same assumption, Camille realized something that stopped her cold. Teresa hadn't changed. She'd just gotten better at hiding it, until power called her bluff. Within hours of Camille's message, Sky High's internal investigation widened. A video call was arranged. Camille was calm, deliberate. She didn't embellish. She didn't need to. She simply described the moment, the words, the way her identity had been reduced to a round number and a ticket price. Avery Campbell listened in silence. When Camille finished, he leaned forward. "Would you be willing to share your story publicly?" he asked. Camille hesitated. "I never thought it mattered, not compared to what just happened to your niece and nephew." Avery's voice softened. "It matters, because what happened to them wasn't an accident, it was a pattern. And patterns become invisible unless someone traces them out loud." She nodded slowly. "Then yes, I'll speak." That evening, Camille's statement was published alongside Sky High's updated public report. It was brief, unsensational, but piercing. "My name is Dr. Camille Rivers. Over a decade ago, I was quietly humiliated by the same flight attendant who recently challenged Jordan and Naomi Campbell. My experience didn't make headlines, but it marked me. For years, I doubted whether it was real enough to matter. I now understand that silence is what makes these moments endure. I stand with Jordan and Naomi, not just because they were wronged, but because they refused to disappear." The response was immediate. The narrative evolved from a single moment to a recurring behavior. Passengers came forward. Whispers turned into testimonies. Archived complaints once buried beneath bureaucracy resurfaced. A story that had started with two teens and a gift box now widened into a full cultural reckoning, one that threatened not just an individual's job, but an entire structure of unchecked authority. In the suite, Naomi sat on the bed, her phone buzzing again. This time it wasn't a meme or a trending clip. It was a direct message from Camille. "I saw your strength. You reminded me of the voice I didn't have at your age. Thank you for speaking, even in silence." Naomi stared at the message for a long time, then typed, "Thank you for believing it mattered." She showed it to Jordan. He read it slowly, then smiled. "She gets it." Naomi nodded. "She got it before we did." Meanwhile, in a modest townhouse on the edge of the city, Teresa Langford sat in the dim light of her living room, watching a news segment that quoted Camille Rivers word for word. For the first time, she didn't reach for a rebuttal. She didn't curse or mutter about being misunderstood. She simply leaned back in her chair and covered her face with both hands. Because it wasn't about one flight, it was about all the quiet moments she thought would never come back to haunt her. And now, they had. The first invitation came in the form of a sealed envelope, hand-delivered by a Sky High liaison to the guest suite where Naomi and Jordan were staying. Inside, a formal letter with the airline's embossed crest, inviting Naomi Campbell to speak at a press conference organized by Sky High's Ethics Reform Committee. The event would be held in the very terminal where their flight had landed, Gate 18 of Denver International, the same gate where Teresa Langford had once stood, confident and unchallenged. Now that gate would serve a different purpose. It would be turned into a platform, not for defense, but for change. At first, Naomi hesitated. She wasn't used to microphones or rooms full of strangers hanging on her every word. She was 15. She'd never even given a school assembly speech, let alone addressed an entire nation of cameras, CEOs, and news anchors. Jordan saw it in her eyes as she read the letter again and again. "You don't have to do it," he said gently. "You've already spoken with your dignity. That's more than enough." But Naomi shook her head. "That's exactly why I have to." Jordan tilted his head. Naomi looked up at him, her eyes steady. "If I let them tell the story for me, they'll turn it into something polite, something clean. I want to say what it felt like. Before people forget, it wasn't just uncomfortable. It was unfair. Jordan smiled. Then say it. The morning of the event, Gate 18 looked nothing like it had days earlier. Gone were the security lines, the silent boarding screens. In their place stood a podium flanked by sky-high executives, equity consultants, and invited press. Rows of chairs were filled with staff, gate agents, junior attendants, and even several pilots still in uniform. Overhead, a massive new banner stretched above the gate. Respect is not a privilege, it's a promise. Naomi arrived in a navy blue dress and a simple braided crown in her hair. She wore no makeup, no jewelry, just a quiet, determined look. In her hands, she still carried the small gold-wrapped gift box, now gently worn at the corners. She refused to let it be forgotten. It had been part of her that day, part of her pain, part of her courage. When the host introduced her, a hush swept the room. Naomi stepped to the podium. For a moment, she stood there in silence, the kind of silence that once felt like fear, but now felt like ownership. Then softly she began. My name is Naomi Campbell. I was told I didn't belong in a seat I paid for. I wasn't told with those exact words. No one needed to say them. It was in the way she looked at me. In this way, she doubted my ticket. In the way she called me a problem before she knew my name. I stayed quiet that day because I was scared. I stayed in my seat not because I was confident, but because I didn't want to break. But what I've learned since then is that holding your place in a world that wants to move you, that's not weakness. That's a strength. I didn't raise my voice, but I was heard. Not because I said something powerful, but because the truth was always loud enough. And the truth is this. You can wear a uniform and still be wrong. You can sit in first class and still be treated like you're less. And you can be 15 years old and still teach grown adults what respect should look like. This is not just about me. This is about everyone who's been told they don't belong. Not with words, but with stares, with silence, with suspicion. You asked me to speak, but all I want is for people to finally listen. The room was silent when she finished. Not a single clap, not at first, just awe. The kind that roots people in place. Then came the wave. It wasn't thunderous. It was deliberate. Row by row, person by person, they rose to their feet. Executives, flight crew, journalists, pilots, gate agents. And still, Naomi stood quietly, holding the gift box in both hands. She didn't smile. She didn't bow. She simply stepped away from the podium and sat down next to Jordan, who reached over and gently squeezed her hand. The video of her speech spread even faster than the phone footage had. The hashtags evolved. The Campbell flight became Naomi spoke. And then, listen first. Airlines across the country began reevaluating their equity training programs. Sky High announced the launch of a new initiative, the First Seat Project, designed to amplify the voices of marginalized travelers and ensure no one would ever again be questioned for sitting exactly where they belonged. That night, as the terminal emptied and the lights dimmed, Naomi and Jordan sat in the lounge beside their uncle, watching the final broadcast wrap up. Jordan leaned over. You did it! Naomi stared at the screen, where her image flickered softly in rewind. No, she said, we did. 3 days after Naomi's speech shook the country, Heather Langford sat in a narrow glass-walled conference room on the 29th floor of Sky High Air's Denver headquarters. Outside, the horizon stretched clean and sharp against a clear spring sky. Inside, the air was still and clinical, like a place meant not for conversation, but for conclusions. She wore civilian clothes now, a pale blue blouse, slacks, no jewelry. Her hair, usually pinned into a flawless chignon, now hung loose around her face. She looked like someone trying not to be recognized, but it was too late for that. Everyone knew her name, and worse, they knew her silence. At the far end of the table sat 5 individuals, 2 HR executives, 1 legal officer, 1 representative from the ethics division, and at the center, Dr. Camille Rivers, recently appointed as an independent equity consultant after her testimony reopened the case. Heather didn't speak as they read the official notice. Miss Heather Langford, you are here for the final review of allegations relating to incident 607DI filed by passengers Jordan and Naomi Campbell involving alleged discrimination, abuse of authority, and failure to follow equity protocols. You are also now under review for additional incidents, brought forward after public testimony revealed a pattern of behavior inconsistent with company values. Heather nodded slowly, mechanically. No one asked if she wanted to add a statement yet. They weren't ready for her words. First, she would have to listen. The legal officer began. Miss Langford, on March 18th, you questioned the boarding legitimacy of two first-class passengers without a policy cause. Their boarding passes were valid. Your reason for confrontation, as recorded in audio and witness testimony, cited instinct. Would you care to elaborate? Heather opened her mouth, then closed it. She looked down at her folded hands. I don't know anymore, she finally whispered. I thought I was protecting order. First class has rules. I didn't recognize them. Camille leaned forward gently. You didn't recognize them, or you didn't expect them? Heather flinched. Camille's voice wasn't accusatory. It was precise, and that made it worse. There's a difference, Camille added. One is a mistake. The other is a belief. Heather swallowed hard. I didn't think they belonged, she said finally. Not because they were black, but because something in me thought first class should look a certain way, and they didn't match it. There it was, the sentence, the one she had never said aloud, not in years of service, not to peers, not even to herself. It hung in the air like oil on water. A younger HR representative, mid-30s, Latina, sharp, spoke next. Miss Langford, do you understand the consequence of that sentence? Not just for your career, but for the lives you intersected with while thinking that way? Heather nodded. No, don't nod, Camille said, her voice firmer now. Say it. Heather hesitated, then forced herself to speak. I do. I understand now that I judged people before they spoke. I enforced rules based on a picture in my head instead of names on a boarding pass. And do you think that picture only applied to Naomi and Jordan Campbell? Camille asked quietly. Heather looked up. Her eyes welled, not with self-pity, but something sharper. I think I've been doing it for a long time, she said, in small ways, ways that didn't look like racism, but were. The ethics officer tapped her pen once. We are not here for confessions. We are here to determine the consequence. Miss Langford, you are no longer employed. That decision is final. What remains is whether you will be barred from reapplication industry-wide. Heather's breath caught. This was it, the career-ending clause, the irrevocable stamp that would follow her into every interview, every flight, every resume check. She opened her mouth, but Camille lifted a hand. One more voice, she said, and from the door behind her, a young woman stepped in, slim, soft-spoken, in her early 20s. She held a printed letter in her hand. My name is Elisha Bennett, she said. I was 19 when I flew alone for the first time. It was a sky-high flight, coach class, seat 31D. I wore a suit because it was a scholarship interview. She glanced at Heather. You told me I couldn't store my portfolio in the forward overhead bin, that it wasn't for my section. I told you it had fragile materials. You made me put it under the seat. It was crushed during the flight. She unfolded the letter. I lost that interview. I never forgot how small I felt. I wanted to be mad at the airline, but I wasn't. I was mad at myself for not being better enough to be seen. She looked Heather directly in the eye. You weren't the only reason, but you were the voice that confirmed my fears. Heather couldn't breathe. I'm not here to destroy your life, Alicia said quietly. I just want you to understand what your assumptions cost other people. People who didn't have uncles in corporate offices. People who just wanted to be seen. She placed the letter on the table, then left without another word. When the door closed behind her, the silence returned, denser now. The final review took just 5 minutes. Heather Langford was permanently barred from any position involving passenger authority in aviation. Her ID was deactivated. Her name entered into an internal industry registry labeled bias violation, final, non-rehirable. She signed the last form without a word. As she rose to leave, Camille stood. One more thing, she said. Heather turned. You can't undo what's been done, but you can still decide what kind of person you'll be when no one is watching. Heather nodded, this time not with resistance, but with reckoning. 1 week after the incident, Sky High Air transformed Gate 18 at Denver International Airport. What was once just another loading zone, another row of black vinyl seats and brushed steel poles, was now something else entirely. A long glass wall bore a new inscription in brushed bronze letters. The first seat, dedicated to dignity, designed for all. In front of it stood two first-class airline seats, authentic, reclaimed from a retired Sky High aircraft. But these weren't trophies. They were symbols. On the headrest of each seat, embroidered in soft silver thread, were two phrases: reserved for those who hold their place with dignity, in memory of every passenger who stayed seated and made history. Jordan and Naomi stood quietly in front of them, not yet seated. Dozens of people had gathered: executives, press, employees, travelers who paused in silent curiosity. Some knew the full story, some only knew its outline, but all sensed that this wasn't just a PR event. It was a cultural turning point. Avery Campbell stepped to the microphone. He wore no tie, no prepared script, just his presence, and the clarity of a man who had seen the system blink and decided it would not blink again. When we say that respect is a policy, not a perk, we mean it. And when we say the future of air travel belongs to everyone equally, we mean that too. But today is not about our company. It's about two young people who didn't raise their voice, but raised a mirror. Jordan, Naomi, you reminded us what integrity looks like. Not in outrage, but in stillness, in quiet courage, in your refusal to give up a seat you had every right to. We failed you. And this space, this seat, is our way of saying, we will never forget that moment, and we will never let it happen again. He stepped back and motioned toward the seats. Would you like to sit? Naomi looked at Jordan. He smiled. Only if you go first. She exhaled slowly, stepping forward. She didn't walk like someone claiming a victory. She walked like someone accepting a responsibility. Naomi sat in the left-hand seat. Jordan followed, taking the right. For a long moment, neither of them moved. A hush fell over the terminal. People paused mid-stride. Flight attendants stopped pushing carts. A toddler clutched their parent's hand and looked up, asking, "What are they doing?" No one answered, because everyone felt the answer. Later, Naomi was asked by a journalist what the seat meant to her now. She paused, then said, "It's not about the seat. It's about never having to prove you belong in it." In the following days, Sky High unveiled their Listen First initiative, created in partnership with Camille Rivers and a coalition of civil rights advocates. Every new hire, from captains to custodians, would be required to complete a program rooted in bias recognition, passenger dignity, and historical context of discrimination in air travel. More importantly, the airline committed to funding a traveling public education exhibit titled Seen Stories from the Sky, a collection of first-hand accounts from passengers of all backgrounds, curated and told in airports across the country. Jordan and Naomi were asked if they wanted to lead it. They declined. Instead, they nominated Alicia Benet, the young woman who had once been told her portfolio didn't belong overhead, the one whose future had been crumpled, not by turbulence, but by assumption. When Alicia stepped onto the national stage, she didn't talk about revenge. She talked about redemption, and that made all the difference. Back in Atlanta, weeks after the cameras had stopped flashing, Naomi and Jordan returned home. Their grandmother, the one who had inspired Naomi to carry herself with grace, greeted them with open arms. In her living room, the gold-wrapped gift box still sat on a shelf. Naomi reached for it one evening, turning it gently in her hands. "I used to think this box would get crushed," she whispered. Jordan looked at her, eyebrow raised. "And now?" Naomi smiled. "Now I think it was never the box that mattered. It was how tightly I held it, what it stood for." Jordan nodded, thoughtful. "We didn't shout," he said. Naomi responded, "but we were heard." On the anniversary of the incident, a year later, no major ceremony was held. Instead, Sky High quietly announced that Gate 18 would now be called the Campbell Terminal. A permanent plaque was installed near the boarding ramp. Not flashy, not corporate, just words. To every traveler told they didn't belong. You do. Your silence is not weakness. Your dignity is not invisible, and your seat, your place, is not up for debate. The lesson, sometimes the loudest act of defiance, is silence. Jordan and Naomi Campbell didn't raise their voices. They didn't demand special treatment. They didn't scream to be seen. They simply held their ground, calm, composed, and dignified, while the world tried to shrink them. And in doing so, they showed us that true power isn't about control, it's about presence. This story isn't just about a flight. It's about how quiet prejudice can wear a uniform. It's about how dignity can sit in row two and still be questioned. And it's about what happens when people finally say, enough, not with fists, but with stillness. Because respect should never be earned through confrontation. It should be given through humanity. And the next time someone is told they don't belong in a space they've rightfully earned, let this story remind us all. Dignity doesn't ask for permission. It simply takes its seat and stays.